So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911, and I want you to think about it in the context of a lot of the other strikes that are happening in the period, like the Pullman strike, the Homestead strike, not a strike, but a riot, depending on how you look at it. The Haymarket Affair, sometimes it's called the Haymarket Riot, depends on how you look at it. The Anthracite coal strike that takes place. And I want you to focus in on those earlier strikes, because all those strikes actually happened prior to this particular strike. And think about what's gained and what's lost in terms of the labor movement and the impact that like industrialization had on them. And just remember again, it's the question again is to what extent was industrialization and urbanization beneficial to people in this period? Also, we're going to take a look at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire as a great example of how sometimes it can lead to some positive outcomes. And as a specific story about New York City that's kind of interesting. It starts off that there was a strike that happened in 1909 at a lot of these shirtwaist makers. And so you really kind of get a sense that this is not just something that happened right away. Like there's something brewing. So we'll be taking a look at the Shirtwaist Factory Fire here. So what is it? First thing is, what in the world is a shirtwaist? This is a shirtwaist right here. A shirtwaist is a blouse. So they made these blouses in these factories for women to wear. So think about, the importance of a blouse like this is probably one of the few items that was easily going to be laundered. Everything else is going to require a lot more work. So the shirtwaist was a way to kind of layer on things and kind of make this a little bit easier. But by this period, the shirtwaist, like by 1911, when the factory has the fire, the shirtwaist itself is actually coming out of style. And so because it's going out of style, people are like going for other things. The factory owners that were making shirtwaists had to like really change things in ways that would eventually harm workers because they had to save some money. So these are the owners of that factory, by the way. So I just want you to know what a shirtwaist is. In 1909, this is approximately what their hours would have been like. So they did a survey of this, probably done by the people within the labor movement that were looking to organize the people. There was a movement, labor organization called the ILGWU, which was the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And they probably did this survey, would be my guess. People within the shirtwaist factories worked a lot of hours. So the vast majority of them worked over 40 hours a week. So we're so used to 40 hours being like the typical work week. Of course, when you're not paid by a salary, you probably work less, rather more, and get paid, but get paid by salary. But these people are working per hour. Total number of people in the industry is, pretty significant. There was a time where almost all of America's clothing was made in New York City. By the 1970s, that gets outsourced to outside of the country. So you may not realize it, but like there was a significant garment worker industry in New York City. That was a big part of New York City. It's why fashion comes out of New York City. It's because of the factories that were there for a long time, but not anymore. So, most of them are working pretty long hours. Some of them working, really extensive hours, but like most of them working in 52 to 57 hours a week. So there was and the big thing here to remember is that the Garment Workers Union, the International Lady Garment Workers Union, and the women's suffrage organizations were tightly knitted to one another. If you got a chance to watch Iron Jawed Angels last year, in that movie, there's a scene where they are trying to make sure that women go out and vote, and they're doing it right outside of a women's garment worker factory. And I think that's kind of the point. So in 1909, they voted for a strike because of the conditions in the factory. And they did it in solidarity with another strike that was happening prior to that in 1909. So here's an example of a song that they sang for solidarity purposes. in the black of the winter of 1909 when we froze and bled on the picket line. So the picket line would be where you would go outside of the factory and have signs. We showed the world that women could fight, and we rose and won the women's might. Hail the wastemakers of 1909, making their stand on the picket line, breaking the power of those who reign, pointing the way, smashing the chain. And we gave new courage to the men who carried on in 1910. So the next year, the men actually went on strike. And shoulder to shoulder will stand through together the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, name of the organization. They were also tied up in socialism as well, for sure. There were people that were definitely within the labor organization that were taking on that point of view. They were also political activists, many of them Jewish, because of the fact that it was the Lower East Side. It kind of fit within that community that lived there. And here's something just so fascinating to me: is this this idea that those that were in favor of the International Lady Garment Workers Union did this cartoon. And in this cartoon, they're showing a little old lady and basically saying, like, you shouldn't really be so afraid of this lady that's trying to strike, because she's just a little lady. Now, maybe it's sexist today, but at the time it was pretty progressive, I guess, to say that you would stand with the labor movement. And the interesting thing about this is that it brings up another point, that the chief breakers of these strikes, other than what you see in the Homestead strike, which were rent-a-cops, basically Pinkertons, that's what they call them, but they were rent-a-cops, just hired force. It was a company that did that. That would break a lot of these strikes. In other places, it was the actual police departments that would do that. And that actually posed a problem for them in terms of their labor organizing. They eventually became a part of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. But it's hard to become part of labor organization if you, as a industry, generally break strikes. So the police had a very hard time eventually breaking into the AFL. But because of their history of breaking up these strikes. Here's an example of that: them arresting girl picketers. And scabs. So scabs are people who would cross the picket line and go into work even though people were striking. These are some images from the period of other strikes. I actually not going to focus on that. So let's talk a little bit about the Shirtwaist factory and the fire that took place. So these are the owners of that factory. And like I said, the Shirtwaist was really kind of going out of business at that time. And the building, this is where the building was. It was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. You could see that there with the big triangle. It wasn't all floors. It was the 8th and the 10th building of the Ash building, which I believe is where NYU is now. There was a fire that took place that we're going to be talking about. To give you a sense of what sweatshops looked like in this period, we have some photos of them. This is not of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, but you can get a sense as to why there was eventually a fire in 1911 that burned the factory down. It's because of a lot of these scraps that are on the floor. So there weren't a lot of great working conditions here. These are much smaller than what the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was. But just look at the amount of fabric that's lying around and think about flammability. And of course, you're always going to end up with lots of fabric on the floor. This one's a little more organized, let's say. But the reason for that is because you're taking at big pieces of cloth and then putting out the pattern on them and cutting them. Here's a great example of that right there. All of that that needs to be picked up. Now, this was the result of the fire itself, and they, in some ways, were better suited to handling this fire. But here, let me try and describe to you what took place and how this fire could possibly have happened. So imagine that this is the floor where the actual knitting was taking place, because I think that's what this was. A floor below it, on the 8th floor of this building, men worked. And what the men did is they were the cutters. That was a good position to be in. And you would sit at these big tables, and you would take the fabric and you lay the fabric onto the big table. And then you take almost like a translucent paper and you put that on top of the fabric. and it had the pattern that you were to cut out for making the shirtwaists. So the men would cut, and then they take the scraps and they put it into the middle of this table, which was like a hole inside the table, and then it went into like it emptied out later, which is a little more of an improvement on some of these photographs which we see here. But this one in particular is real bad. So then that fabric would go upstairs, and then the women would work and sew. And they would be in big rooms like this. I think what's happening here is that you're seeing the ninth floor, because the men worked on the 8th floor and the women worked on the 10th floor. So 10th floor. So all around here were probably sewing machines, and these little things are coming down are electricity to to the machines that were in the center and around here. So everything was pretty tightly packed in. Men are cutting, they're smoking at the same time. They're taking the scraps, they're putting it inside of the middle of this wooden table. Probably what happened is that one of the embers from the smoke got into the fabric and then into the middle of the table where all the fabric really was laying until they were going to dispose of it. And it went on fire. The fire traveled upstairs. And it was like 146 women that went to their death, having two choices. One, which was to jump out of the window or to burn inside. You might ask yourself, why burn inside? Well, they were very concerned, the owners of the factory, that people were going to people were actually going to escape and leave too early. So they locked the doors while the women worked in the factory. And because of it, here's the next photo. Because of it, a lot of women died as a result of it, because there was no clear way out. And there's also no sprinklers either. And so this cartoonist is basically saying that it was greed that led to the fire. And the fire escape wasn't durable. You would think that a fire escape would be able to survive a fire, and instead it looks like one of those DNA strands that was burned and melted by the fire. So this is the fire that happened on the 10th floor. Some people did survive, but many did not. This is what happened is people had to go and identify the dead. The important thing here with all these photographs isn't to gross you out or anything, but is to show you that this was documented. There was something about photography and the ability to kind of show what was the actual working conditions. So as industrialization got better, photography got better, media got more able to kind of be a muckraker, like we talked about before. And all of these images made the papers. This is an example of that in the New York Journal. The funerals were widely reported on. We have protesters that went to those funerals, labor unions that went, women's movement that got involved. The governor, it was a commission that was formed. And out of the ashes, you see that the labor movement grows. In other words, the ILGWU grows in its membership. New York City created a Bureau of Fire Prevention, so there were some bureaucratic things that were put into place. New building codes were passed, tougher inspections of all sweatshops in New York City. And there was a growing momentum of support for women's suffrage. And that's undeniable that this had, this women's suffrage has some connection with the fire of 1911. So it wasn't totally in vain, but 146 had to die to make it happen. Eventually, in the 1930s, the government creates something called OSHA, which still is around today, to make sure that people are safe in their workplaces. And eventually get the Wagner Act, which is considered to be the Magna Carta for the union movement. But that's not until we get into a Great Depression. So that's another reason why some of these things are created, is because of the fire that happens here, but also like the downturn in the economy and how that affected everyone else, not just people in New York City and not just those women that fell and perished in the fire. But out of the ashes, there were a lot of improvements that were made, eventually nationalized. So that's the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.